Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week video. This is episode number 218. So, after last week's breakaway for the second episode in the newest EP of the Week series, I've returned this week for another Album of the Week. Today, I'm celebrating the 40th anniversary for one of my personal favorite AC/DC albums, Flick of the Switch. Their 8th national release and overall 9th studio album. Released on August 15th via both Albert Productions in Australia and New Zealand, and Atlantic Records nationally. So, with all that said, let's begin. After parting ways with Robert John Mutt Lange in 1982, after the unsatisfying result that was For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, come on, Robert wasted more months on just wanting to perfect the drum sound. So, for their next record, they decided to do the record themselves, with at least the help of Tony Platt. So, beginning in April of 1983, they would venture back to Compass Point Studios located in the Bahamas. According to Tony Platt, there was a genuine desire to get back to the basics with Flick of the Switch. There was a general kind of consensus that we needed to find some way of moving on a little bit. You know, the Johnny Winter version of Muddy Waters' Mamish Boy, where they're all shouting in the background. Basically, what Mal had said was that he wanted to try and get that feeling of being in a room with it all happening. I don't think it really worked entirely. As into the recording, issues began to arise with drummer Phil Rudd, who had been with AC/DC since 1975's Australian-released album TNT. According to the tour manager at the time, Ian Jeffrey, who had received a phone call from Rudd while AC/DC was in Nebraska during the Back in Black tour, who was all strung out, he then found Rudd in his hotel room in a, as they're recalled, state of disoriented agitation. Rudd broke down crying and begged Jeffrey to don't tell Malcolm. Jeffrey also revealed that Malcolm punched Rudd after he showed up 2 hours late to play the last song of the encore. As he further recalls the accounts, it was an absolutely stupid thing that finished it, but it had been brewing for a long, long time. Jeffrey further remembers he got into drugs and got burned out. Of course, I've read that this was merely the aftermath of Bon Scott's death. From what's been stated, that Bon Scott's death had such an impact on the members that they didn't know how to completely cope with it all. So for Rudd, and Malcolm in future events, they began spiraling into addictions. This became all too much for Rudd to handle, to then which became all too much for even the band to even handle. Rudd's addictions got out of control, and midway through into the recording of the album, Rudd was then fired. He, of course, would return to AC/DC for 1995's Ballbreaker. While Rudd did manage to complete his drum tracks, they tried to hire other drummers to record new drum tracks. Former Procol Harum drummer B.J. Willis was sorta hired to help with the completion, but only if needed, which he wasn't, and AC/DC kept Rudd's drum tracks. Tony Platt later then recalled that it wasn't a happiest of albums. There were all sorts of tensions within the band. They were all pretty knackered by that point. It was the album that copped the backlash, really. The album was finally finished by May, and by August, the album would then be sold to stores and be met with polarizing opinions from either both critics and its fan base. So, featuring 10 tracks, clocking in at the length of 37 minutes and 2 seconds, these 10 tracks, of course, beginning with Rising Power, This House is on Fire, the title track, Nervous Shakedown, Landslide, Guns for Hire, Deep in the Hole, Bedlam in Belgium, Badlands, and then finally ending with Brain Shake. So there it is. There's your 10 tracks. Now, was Flick of the Switch really deserving of the negative responses? This was always something I questioned after years spending my life listening to this album. I have such a sentimental fondness for this one. It's the same I have for both Ball Breaker and, of course, Highway to Hell. These were my earliest introductions to AC/DC. For this one here, it was by 2003, when the new crop of remasters came out, was when my dad would add 2 other AC/DC albums to the stash. Those were being Let There Be Rock and here, Flick of the Switch. Now, I was all over both albums. I practically played them to death. But for some reason, I was more drawn to Flick of the Switch. I know that's probably blasphemous because of this is Brian Johnson and not Bon Scott. And technically, you're supposed to always pick the Bon Scott albums, but me, I marched to a different drum beat, okay? Up to this point, I was now exposed to Judas Priest, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath / Ozzy Osbourne, Blue Oyster Cult, and Thin Lizzy, and to an extent Iron Maiden. Judas Priest was my first taste of what 80s metal sounded, but something about Flick of the Switch felt primal. There was a more cleanness to it than compared to like Let There Be Rock, but it felt more lively than something like Ball Breaker, of course. I was pretty mesmerized by the overall tone. Alongside Judas Priest, from there on, AC/DC became one of my first loves for music and opened me up to stuff that had the same energy and tone. So that's why I am so connected to this album. This was one of the biggest reasons for me to get into loud, heavy music. And to this day, I still come back to this album. But I tend to come back out with new things to love and appreciate about it. It's why I'm so much in awe how much this album was panned at the time. For a band who was pretty agitated during the recording, the end result couldn't be more the opposite. To me, I think the tensions added to the performances of the album. It's like it made them play heavier here. I mean, they wanted to go back to a more stripped down sound, basically return to the days of when Vanda and Young produced the band. So while this not have fully recaptured the magic of those Bon Scott era albums, what did get captured was a loud, heavy rock and roll album. Now, I'm not going to go through every song, but mention a couple so you get where I'm getting at here with. I like to point out that the drums in Rising Power, I always hear that saying that every AC/DC song sounds the same or exactly the same depending on who you're asking, basically meaning the same drum patterns and shit. I feel that with Rising Power, it actually has its own identity, and it's with the drum patterns here. Rudd added fills to this that isn't just your standard hard rock pattern. If anything, he played around with it to come up with something that was simple but really effective, and it makes Rising Power such a standout song here. I know it's not one of the faster songs, but again, it just has something to it that is still pretty powerful in its own right. No pun intended, to the title of the song. Then there is Landslide. AC/DC has done some fast songs in the past, and even after this one, but something about Landslide feels pretty damn fast. I mean, this is typical Aussie pub boogie rock that was also perfected by both the Angels and Rose Tattoo, but this also feels more like it was the direct result of paying attention to the likes of Motorhead and, to an extent maybe, the new wave of British heavy metal, where it feels more visceral than your usual past AC/DC boogie song like Let There Be Rock, which was quasi-thrashy with its picking, and of course there was Rocker, Riff Raff, whatever. So this always felt pretty metal coming from AC/DC. Then there's Guns for Hire, which is also pretty heavy in its approach. Then of course we have Bedlam in Belgium, which definitely in a way recaptured the old spirit of the Bon Scott era of AC/DC. Hell, the inspiration for this came from an incident that involved a riot that took place at Connacht, which is located in Antwerp, Belgium, in the 70s. Not when in the 70s. Apparently a riot nearly broke out when the police tried to close down the show after the band allegedly ignored a strict 11 p.m. curfew. So most of Brian's recollections is almost like sung through the eyes of Bon Scott. Then of course, I can't forget Nervous Shakedown. This is a slow yet heavy blues-based number, but it's played with so much vigor. The lyrics too are quite cool. It's like a prison story put to the sounds of rock music. Then of course, we have the ending song, Brain Shake. Again, classic AC/DC. Really, for the most part, this is all catchy songs with plenty of hooks. Even the weakest song here, Deep in the Hole, is still fun. Again, I can also point out other good ones that I've just enjoyed just as much. Again, the title track, even This House is on Fire. I even kind of have a soft spot for even like Badlands, of course, with this sort of outlawish kind of feel to it. But again, it's very tongue-in-cheek, and you kind of can get the idea what the lyrics are about. Again, this one, of course, was trying to really go back to the sort of sexual-oriented lyrics of the past. But again, what's kind of missing, you can say, is Bon Scott's wit and charm. But even at that, I get the aspect of what they were going for. And to an extent, I think it kind of worked for what they were trying to accomplish here. So, again, this, in any ways, this is still one of the great albums, I feel, from the Brian Johnson era of AC/DC here. I know the production is ragged on, but I actually feel that the production was also perfect for this album, besides, again, what they were going for. Again, Tony Platt, I feel, doesn't get enough credit. Like I pointed out in my analysis for those about to rock, Tony Platt was the one who I felt was more responsible for how Back in Black turned out. He was the one who kept Robert in check. I mean, go and do a side-by-side comparison of both albums, and you'll understand the difference here. Tony Platt did more for the sound of Back in Black than I think Mutt Lange did. He pretty much takes full credit. Every other album, though, that I've listened to that Mutt did without Tony Platt shows why. Nothing ever comes close. That's why I think people's assessments of Flick of the Switch's production sound is blindsided. Mutt Lange may have been responsible for emphasizing on the backing vocals in other studio tracks, but as far as an album's overall sound, he lacked in that, and he still lacks in that. That's why For Those About to Rock turned out the way it did, and why Flick of the Switch sounds the way it does. While Mutt Lange's cleanness is absent, what's still present is Tony Platt's sharpness. It's dry, but even Back in Black was kind of dry too. Tony Platt added character to the sound, and that's what you get here. This still sounds big and explosive, and why I will always take Tony Platt over Robert John Mutt Lange, who I just think is the single most overrated producer in music. Bar none. Hands down. Overrated. I mean, I covered this year Pyromania, and that is just all the more I need to overemphasize on why I think Robert John Mutt Lange is one of the most absolute overrated producers in rock music, and I'll just take the sort of Tony Platt's dry sort of approach to the sort of state-of-the-art kind of production style of Robert John Mutt Lange, who ruined almost every other band to begin with. So, yeah, I know that's probably going to get me some hate from my other fans, whatever, but I don't care. It's my personal thoughts. This was one of the band's most panned albums. Even Malcolm Young over the years became lukewarm to this album. But these days, it has its devoted fan base, who even at times prefer this over Back in Black. Probably because this album hasn't been played to death by radio. I, for one, will always show my love for this album, and for me to finally spotlight this on its 40th anniversary makes me feel proud. This is easily my favorite of the Brian Johnson era, with Fly on the Wall being my second favorite, but I'll save my thoughts for that one whenever I get around to it. So, for those who have spent years living with this album, if you have any thoughts, whether they are positive or negative, you can leave them all in the comment section below. But if you were one of those who felt disappointed with this album when it came out, or even still years after it had been released or whatever, or whenever you got around to actually listening to this album is what I'm getting at there, I suggest that you revisit this one. For all we know, it's probably been a long, and I mean a long time, and it might now finally click with you. So with that, this is Heavy Thrashhead saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.